Hello, ladies and gentlemen of World Civilizations 2. Welcome back. Today, we're going to wrap things up in our Imperialism week by looking at some of the imperialism and colonization examples in Asia. So, since we already explained the background of imperialism, colonialism last time, we'll just jump right into the action today. Don't worry, I just said we sort of out of habit. I know there's no one else but me teaching this class. My mind hasn't broken quite that much yet. We're getting there, but not yet. Ask me again around week 12 maybe, and we'll see how I'm doing. But in the meantime, as always, we're going to start off on key terms. As you can see, this lesson's going to be a bit shorter today. Don't say I never did anything for you. In the meantime, we're going to look at the Dutch East India Company today, essentially the counterpart of the British one. We'll look at the cultivation system of colonization. We'll look at the Spanish-American War, and we're going to look at a place called Indochina or Indochina. I believe it's pronounced Indochina. If you haven't noticed, I'm terrible at pronunciation. But anyway, also, your upcoming due dates should be pretty straightforward. They're just the same as the ones from topic 1. So I won't spend much time talking about them, but just do remember that these last two major assignments especially, their prompts and rubrics are already on Moodle, so you should be able to get prepared, or at least forewarned, pretty far in advance. In the meantime, I do want to have a bit of an overview of colonization in the Middle East and Africa again. Think about from last class who were the dominant imperial powers in the Middle East and Africa. Think about how the other European powers are going to react, and think about how that might help create potential global conflict. How might those alliances in particular help bring more and more people into this and cause more violence? Keep that in mind for next week especially. So, first up, we are going to look at Dutch colonization in Asia. In 1581, the Netherlands officially declared their independence from Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula. In 1602, the Dutch allowed a charter for the Dutch United East India Company, which will for now on be referred to as the VOC. Eventually, by 1609, William of Orange, who was the former governor of the Netherlands, became the King of England after the Glorious Revolution in 1689. Don't have much time, naturally, since this is a survey course to get into that, but the main thing you need to be aware of is that after this revolution, there was intense cooperation between the Dutch and the English in their commercial interests. Since they're basically ruled by someone, the British are now ruled by someone who used to be the governor in the Netherlands, makes sense that there'd be quite a strong alliance. By 1755, the VOC became the de facto government in Java, for example. This was an island in Indonesia. Now, how is this similar to how the East India Company behaved in India? Remember how they started off their imperialism first before the government got directly involved. Awkward silence again. But yes, this is essentially the indirect colonization and imperialism that the East India Company practiced. Instead of coming right in and using government and violence to try to take over everything and ignite maybe a more passionate response, they started setting up things more indirectly and eventually gained complete economic control of the country. This can be a very effective method because it does seem less oppressive at first and may not invite as much resistance. The Dutch colonial practices, however, were also very interesting / depressing. By 1830, after Belgium split up from the Dutch and formed their own independent kingdom, the Dutch developed what was called the cultivation system for their colonies in India. Now, why would Belgium splitting from the Dutch encourage them to come up with this new system? Awkward pause again. I never know where to look during these. But yeah, to answer that question, as you might have guessed, you need to look at what the cultivation system was actually like. In this system, indigenous peoples in the new colonies were essentially given two options. You can grow government-owned crops on 20% of your land, or you can work for various periods of 60 days on Dutch plantations. This was seen necessary after Belgium was gone because they needed to come up with an intensive way to make up the lost revenue and gain the lost resources. This forcing indigenous people to, in one way or another, support the state economy, it's going to help make up those losses. By 1903, the system was so effective that the last of the opponents to Dutch rule in Indonesia were defeated, and all of the conquered land was turned over to private plantation owners. So essentially, this cultivation system can now spread across all of Indonesia. Around this same time, Spain was starting to set up their colony in the Philippines. Spain began expanding into Southeast Asia in order to compete with the Portuguese and eventually the Dutch holdings in Indonesia. Again, how does this demonstrate imperialism's effect on international relations and what can be the consequences? As I sit here listening to nothing, can't wait for in-person classes again. But yes, this is essentially, as you might have guessed, just another example of one of the major effects of imperialism I've been talking about. When one empire seems to be doing well, it's going to encourage other countries to compete with them. This can help lead once again to more global conflicts, which obviously, as you might imagine, has pretty upsetting effects upon the rest of the world. By 1520, the Spanish had discovered the Philippines and were to establish a colony there within 50 years. Interesting thing to remember about this colony is that unlike the other Spanish colonies, it essentially had no Creole class, which if you remember is essentially a mixed Spanish and Philippine elite class system. People who are descended from some of the elite natives and original Spanish arrivals and conquistadors were the ones who traditionally had power in these colonies we mentioned earlier. Instead, the elites were almost entirely locals. Why would this be such a problem for Spain, actually? Think about where the wealth's going to go. Yes, very good. Class is hopefully viewing this in the future. Since the elite class doesn't have as many direct ties to Spain, the wealth is actually going to stay fairly local and not as much of it's going to be going back to Spain. For example, these local elites resisted land and tax reform. They didn't want this money to spread across the colony or to go back to Spain. They hoarded the wealth in a local oligarchy. Also, these upper class were not very loyal to the Spanish, and by the 1890s, some urban intellectuals, such as Jose Rizal, led a revolt against the Spanish to get Spanish involvement out entirely. Because of this, the Spanish did very quickly decline in their power in the Philippines. By 1892, Jose Rizal and the Katipunan leaders, as they were called, led a series of revolts against Spain. Rizal was executed by 1896, but by 1897 there was a compromise reached between the Katipunan and the Spanish, where armed revolts would end in exchange for leadership being allowed to flee and not killed or prosecuted into Hong Kong. Now, how does this maybe demonstrate Spanish weakness in the Philippines? Alright, so this is probably a fairly obvious one. They're not able to completely subdue and control their colonies like some of the other countries we've looked at have been able to do so. Because of the increased competition from these other countries in the Industrial Revolution, Spain is declining and the Spanish Empire is greatly declining during this period. For example, during the Spanish and Americans did go to war in 1898, initially as a result of Cuban independence movements. The United States officially wanted to support Cuban independence, while the Spanish wanted to preserve this colony. This led to also war in the Philippines. For example, in Manila Bay, a Spanish squadron was defeated by the U.S. Navy, and Emilio Aguinaldo was eventually rescued by America from Hong Kong, and was declared and officially came to the Philippines and declared it independent. However, Americans actually ignored the 1898 peace agreement and independence, took control of Spain as the Philippines as a colony for themselves, and subdued all rebels in the country by 1913. Now, just to focus on this for a little bit and bring some connections to America, why do you think this is not typically taught in American history courses? As I stroke my beard like a weirdo, James Bond villain. I love that analogy for some reason. But yeah, think about how America is typically defined and what kind of identity we like to set for ourselves. We like to see ourselves as sort of an independence movement like the Cubans, for example. We fight for independence, we fight for freedom, and all those wonderful things. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say we never do that. However, when America does do things like this, where we ignore someone's independence movement and just take them over anyway, that kind of contrasts with how Americans and Americans see themselves and how the American government and military wants to portray itself. So, again, while I'm not saying that America has never fought for justice or freedom, There are instances that tend to contradict that, and those are typically not as focused on in our American history courses. So we need to make sure we are aware of them. Now, the last thing we'll look at for this is the French involvement in Vietnam. The initial French incursion went into Vietnam, but was rebuffed by Vietnamese kings who shared China's initial policy of isolationism. Now, quick reminder from when we talked about China and Japan. Why did many of these Asian countries practice isolationism at this point? Very good review. Excellent. They typically feared European involvement and losing their independence and autonomy. For example, remember what happened in China that might reinforce this. Many Vietnamese, as history progressed, were aware of what went on during things like the Opium Wars and British involvement in China. The Vietnamese became increasingly passionate about trying to prevent this kind of involvement. However, between 1858 and 1862, the French were able to expand their control of Vietnam. Under the King Napoleon III, they were able to occupy the Mekong River Delta. By 1863, the French had officially defeated the Chinese in the Sino-French War to control northern Vietnam, and eventually united North and South into South Vietnam into the colony that was known as Indochina. Between 1893 and 1904, the French eventually added Cambodia and Laos to their Indochina colony, increasing their hold in Southeast Asia. To give you a bit of an idea of what the conditions were like in this colony. As with pretty much every other place we've talked about, plantations were almost immediately established in Vietnam / Indochina as it was known at that time. They were particularly after coffee, tea, and rubber. Indigenous farmers were forced to turn over about 40% of their crops to the colonial government. This, of course, led to uprisings and discontent, as you might imagine. In 1898, Phan Boi Chau, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, witnessed the violent suppression of Confucian scholars and protests by French authorities. Between 1908 and 1909, he then led anti-tax demonstrations and uprisings in Europe. By 1912, an official Vietnamese nationalist group had formed to try to fight against the French and establish a free democratic republic, primarily relying upon guerrilla warfare. For those of you who are a bit familiar with later Vietnamese history, how is the emergence of these nationalist and guerrilla groups going to affect later history? To give you a hint on that, think about what happens during events like the Vietnam War. Do these groups quickly go away? Think about that as we continue studying the history of colonialism and foreign involvement in Vietnam throughout this course. In the meantime, a couple of things to wrap this up. Putting it all together, again, what role did all this colonizing play in the Industrial Revolution? As I keep things blank. I can't talk, as I stare blankly at the screen. There we go. But yes, as you might remember from last week, and as I've talked about earlier this week as well, this colonizing essentially gave the Europeans the resources and the power they needed in order to have the Industrial Revolution happen in the first place and to help it continue. I believe, personally, and from a historical perspective, that this is important to remember. A couple of reasons. It essentially means mainly that the European nations and other nations across the world can't pass this off as Europeans being superior, like, for example, Livingston tried to do that I talked about last time. It is important to remember that all the technological and economic success Europeans had during this time period essentially came from the exploitation of others. It's not necessarily just a national superiority, it is about exploiting other people. So that is important to remember. Now, that leads me into my next question, which you can probably already guess my thoughts on. But it's something I wanted you to think about for the rest of the semester. Is it ever okay to justify imperialism by saying it led to such significant technological achievements? Because on the other side, you could argue that things like railroads, great boats, all these great cities and inventions wouldn't have been possible if the Industrial Revolution had never happened. So many people do try to use that to justify colonization. Is that ever okay? Think about that for the rest of the semester. And finally, more directly, leading into next week, think about how some of these imperial rivalries we've talked about over the past couple of days are going to impact future world history. In the meantime, that's all I've got for you this time. Just do remember these upcoming reminders: content quiz, midterm, and debate, all coming up a bit sooner than you might realize, so please make sure you are as forewarned and prepared as possible. So I've got for you this time. Have a great rest of your week.